What are the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence over an extended period of time?
Hey, Ron, it's good to have you here on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Okay, there's so much to get to, man, but I am fascinated by this idea of reverse engineering something. And I think this is done a lot when talking about, and you've written about it certainly at the beginning of your book, whether it's Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and Michael Dell. And I actually want to start with the third one there, maybe the least known of the three, although really impressive in his own right. So for his 16th birthday, I read that he got an Apple II computer and he took it to his room and he did what?
So his parents get him a birthday present. They gave him a brand new computer. What does he do? He takes it apart. He doesn't even bother turning it on. He takes it apart because he wants to understand how it's made. And what that represents is just the way that thoughtful, inquisitive, curious leaders think, is they don't just passively observe an experience that is extraordinary. They try to decode it and understand what is it that makes this work. And that is a mindset that we can all use regardless of what it is that we work on. So let's say you encounter a memo that is just really impactful, an email that really moves you, a speech that you find inspiring. There are all of these techniques that I talk about in Decoding Greatness that you can use to figure out what makes them different. And I'll just give you a preview of one of them, and that is to play a game that we all played as children called Spot the Difference. And all it takes is, as you recall from the game, where you have one visual on the right and another on the left, and you have to spot what is different about these two images. That's what we can do. That mindset is one that we can apply by comparing extraordinary examples to simply ordinary examples and figure out what is it that's different about this extraordinary example. And by simply playing Spot the Difference, you can't help but identify the ingredients that contribute to making something great. And the next step, obviously, is applying that to your next iteration. But it is through that mindset of curiosity and learning that we can all elevate our skills.
So I'm curious from the nature versus nurture part of this question, Ron, and that is, was Michael Dell born this way, or did his parents cultivate this curiosity in him? Was it the environment? Obviously, it's probably a little bit of both, but I'm curious, since you're the scientist here, you're the PhD,
Yeah.
Where does this come from?
What every scientist will tell you is it's always both.
Yeah.
It's always both. And it's impossible to tease the two apart because we don't run controlled experiments that enable us to put Michael Dell in a cage and compare him to his normal self and then identify what are the key differences when we take away his environment. But the point is, really, it doesn't really matter, honestly. What matters is if we can identify the techniques that top performers use to get to where they are and figure out ways of incorporating them into our everyday lives, we can improve our chances of succeeding. And that's what Decoding Greatness is about, is figuring out what are the top performers doing differently. And obviously, reverse engineering is a key part of it. And just to step back a second, the argument that I make in the book is that the stories we've been told about success are wrong. Most of us have been taught that success comes from one of two things: either talent, the idea that you're born with certain inner strengths, and that the key to finding your greatness is simply finding a field that allows your innate talent to shine. The second story is that greatness comes from practice, the idea that if you just put in the 10,000 hours and you have the appetite for doing lots of hard work, then eventually you will improve and get to a level of greatness that you could only have dreamt about if you hadn't put in that time. But there's a third story about greatness, and it's one that people don't often talk about. And it's evident in these examples of Steve Jobs, Steve Gates, Michael Dell, but also people like Stephen King and Malcolm Gladwell and Judd Apatow. And that's reverse engineering. It's all about finding great works and then decoding them, figuring out what is it that makes this unique and how do I apply this to my work.
I love this, Ron. I mean, this is really kind of what my show's all about, is trying to understand the uncommon commonalities among leaders who are sustaining excellence. So let's get practical for a second. Let's say there's somebody who's currently a vice president in a Fortune 500 company. So they're not the CEO, but they're not a frontline worker anymore, not an individual contributor. They're running an organization within an organization. Okay. That's our avatar for this particular example. and that person has, aggressive goals. They got to hit certain levels of revenue. They're in charge of a couple different product lines, and they got a sales team and marketing and finance, right? They got P&L responsibility, the profit and loss. So for that person, and they're reading your book, and your book is one of those, and I got to give you huge props here. It's one of those ones where it's really hard to stop, and I think it's as good a compliment as you can give a writer. It's just hard to stop because I got to keep going. I got to keep going. I got to keep, So for that person, Ron, what are some of the key kind of frameworks or mindsets they could start implementing right now to help grow their business and grow their own leadership as well?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you. That's very kind of you. And you're right. That is, that's the nicest compliment you can give someone who's a writer. And just to your point about the book feeling addicting to read, that is me reverse engineering what works in fiction. So you'll notice that there are cliffhangers. That's usually not something you find in business books, and it's something that you will find in a lot of shows and a lot of fiction. And it's all about identifying what are the elements that are resonating for you as a viewer in all kinds of experiences. And one of the things I love about this formula of using reverse engineering is it gives you license to just go ahead and enjoy whatever it is you enjoy without feeling guilty about it. Because as long as you're applying this mindset of thinking in formulas and identifying what are the blueprints that makes this work, you're identifying components that you can then introduce into your own work. But back to your question, how do we make this practical? The first step that I would urge everyone listening to start doing is to start collecting, become a collector. And here's what I mean by that. When we think about collections, we think about physical objects. We think about shoes or stamps or wines or books. But that definition is far too narrow. If you look at the people who are really experts in their field, they start by collecting. And so my designer friends collect logos. My copywriter friends collect headlines. I'm a writer. I collect openings, transitions, and conclusions because I want to understand why is it that they work, and I want to templatize them, turn them. So it's all about collecting, identifying what works, and then turn it into a template that you can then apply to your future work. So in the case of this vice president, if there's an email that is really impactful for you, put that in your collection. If there's a deck that you find that you think is really interesting, put that in your collection. If there's a speech that someone has made, whether it be a TED Talk or a presidential candidate, or there are particular lines that you find moving, put them in your collection. What that does is it enables you to go and visit it like a private museum the next time you need to generate something that is extraordinary. And now you have some inspiration to draw from and reminder to think big.
Interesting. So collecting is the first point. You know what? You mentioned speeches. I've read a lot about presidential speech writers and listened to them on podcasts because I'm fascinated by great speakers and great speeches, like having it go from your mind to the page and then delivering the speech. And John Favreau was a big time. You probably know John, actually. He's a big time writer for President Obama. And he would read every speech in written form, and he would watch them or listen to them as he was writing speeches for President Obama. And I love listening to John talk about his process for putting those talks together and then giving it to his boss, and they would go back and forth and edit them. But usually there was so much taken from the greatness of speeches in history. And I think that's like he reverse engineered the process, like what really hit, what moved the American people. And he took from that, you borrowed, reverse engineered, whatever you call it, and implemented some of that style into his writing. And that's what led to these incredible speeches.
Without question. Ryan, let me let you and your listeners in on a secret. Everyone who's at the top of their game, who's a creative professional, is doing this, and no one's written about it. And when I tell my friends who work in advertising agencies or consulting what I'm writing about, everyone, the response I get was uniform, which is, I do that all the time, but I've never read about it. No one's ever taught me how to do that. And so that's why these techniques are so critical. And just to make this even more concrete, in the case of John Favreau, if you and I, for example, let's say we ended up in someone's campaign, we had to generate a speech tomorrow. The first thing you would do is take a speech that you think is amazing and then work backwards. And so in Decoding Greatness, I talk about all these techniques that you can use that range from something I call reverse outlining, which is everyone's heard of outlining. When you're a college student, you would outline your paper by putting in bullet points what you're going to put in every paragraph, and then you would write those paragraphs. Reverse outlining is traditional outlining's sneak your cousin, which is take a finished product and then work backwards to see if you wanted to reduce every paragraph into one bullet point, what would it look like? And by the time you're done, you've got an outline of what needs to happen in every paragraph. And that's a template that you can then apply to your speech. So that's one approach, reverse outlining. Another approach you can do is just take the transcript of the speech and identify in each paragraph what the emotion is. What's the emotional trajectory of this speech? And simply label it as a plus if it brings up positive emotions, a minus if it brings up negative emotions, and maybe, I don't know, a circle if it does nothing, it's neutral. And then what you could do is take that list of plus, circle, minus, and graph it out so that you can see what's happening in the speech. And Kurt Vonnegut used to do this with popular stories. And so he would compare different stories, and instead of mapping out what's happening in every paragraph, in the case of Kurt Vonnegut, what he would do is graph out what's happening for the main character. How are things going? Are things going well for the main character? Are things going poorly? And what he found in doing this is that all of the world's stories can be broken down into 6 main narratives. And so just as an example, and so you might listen to that and think, hey, how could that be? Just 6 stories? Look at Netflix. There are thousands of movies on there. Could it just be 6 stories? Well, compare Cinderella and Annie. It's the same story with different characters. At the beginning, things are going poorly for the main character, right? Annie's an orphan. Cinderella's being abused by her stepsisters and her evil stepmother. Then something good happens. Cinderella goes to the ball. Annie gets rescued by Daddy Warbucks. Then something terrible happens. Cinderella, clock strikes midnight. She's got to go home. She's back to square one. Annie gets kidnapped by people pretending to be her parents. And then finally, after a climax, things work wonderfully out for both characters. In the case of Cinderella, she lives happily ever after with Prince Charming. In the case of Annie, she goes back to living with Daddy Warbucks, and the rest is history. So it's the same story multiple times. We don't even recognize it because the context has shifted. And that's the power of reverse engineering what's happening on the level of the main character's fortunes, as Kurt Vonnegut would have it. And once you do that, you develop the structures and the patterns to start creating your own work, which is so much easier than starting out with a blank page.
Back to being practical for our avatar, Ron. Okay, so the first piece of advice in the application that they can do immediately as they get done listening to this episode is they become a collector. Okay, right? So they're collecting the emails that really move them. They collect speeches. They collect of stories or of information they're finding from others that are excellent at the craft. Okay, what's next? What's another thing they can do?
Okay, so that is the analysis phase, which is basically variations of spot the difference. So we talked about all a number of different analyses that you can do on the work to identify what's different about the extraordinary versus the ordinary. Once you've identified what the elements are that you think are contributing to the object's success, now you want to create a template. So the template might take the form of, let's say, in the case of writing the presidential speech, you might start off by talking about how you see great things for the country. Then, whatever the steps are, the ingredients are that you've identified in your reverse engineered examples, create a template for yourself. And then crucially, you want to create metrics that you can then rate your work on as a scoreboard. So I talk about this as the scoreboard principle within the book. And the scoreboard principle simply means that anything you measure, you are likely to improve on. I say it more lyrically in the book, which is measurement begets improvement. Anything you measure, you will likely improve on. We know this from the research. So if you want to increase your water consumption, monitor your H2O intake every day. You want to lose weight, measure your calorie intake every day. You want to increase your focus, then start measuring how many interrupted minutes you have every day of deep work. So we know this from the research. Anything you measure, you're likely to improve. So the key is to identify what are the components that I want to make sure that I hit on in my speech or whatever it is I'm writing that will definitely put me down the path of succeeding, and then rate how well your execution does on your scoreboard. So those if we were to just, reduce it down to a few sentences: collect, analyze, turn it into a template, give yourself a scoreboard, execute.
Austin Kleon writes a lot about this, like steal like an artist, and I imagine that's part of your research as well. In that the greats are regularly trying to take bits and pieces from all others that they admire, that they look up to, that they respect, that they deem as excellent, and then kind of mashing it together with their own personality, and then that becomes them, and you kind of become maybe a little bit more original as you go. But this process of always being a collector of what's great out there, combining it with maybe your unique skills or contributions or just your natural personality, and that's what I feel like your process seems to be when it comes to decoding greatness and becoming, I think, an excellent leader. This is a process to do it.
Right. And it requires different processes for the different elements of your job. And I think it's all about having a mindset of A, curiosity, but also B, thinking in blueprints. Every time you experience something extraordinary, don't just enjoy it passively. Think about, how does this work? How do I recreate it? And how do I apply it to something that I'm working on in order to improve? And so I think just having that mindset of curiosity, of breaking things down, figuring out what the elements are, is a crucial step that doesn't get discussed enough. And I'll give you another example from the book, which is the story of Barack Obama. While we're on the topic of John Favreau and Barack Obama, why don't we just bring it home? Barack Obama was a terrible politician when he first started, and he got trounced his first race. He lost by a margin of more than 2-1. He considered leaving politics until he decided to observe what it is that pastors were doing in delivering sermons at churches. And in doing that, he came to realize that there are certain elements that he could import into politics. And so he started using repetition. He started varying his tone. He started slowing down and pausing for effect and telling stories from the Bible. And he came back to politics and just was a completely different speaker. And one thing that I should note is that part of the reason why he was a terrible speaker is because he was a law school professor and was used to lecturing students. And voters didn't appreciate being lectured to, but they did appreciate being admired, as churchgoers do. And that insight, I think what the story tells us is that the story of Barack Obama illustrates that you can take elements from different fields and incorporate them into your own. It's not just about reverse engineering somebody else's speech. And it's certainly not about finding your talent or practicing harder, which is what we've been taught. It's about identifying what are the elements that are working in other fields. How do I incorporate them into mine to not just reproduce someone's winning formula, but evolve it to make it my own.
You've written about the fact that Starbucks and Chipotle, two places that I frequent quite a bit, ultimately come down to the same exact strategy. What is their strategy?
Yeah, so on the surface, they're very different stores. One's selling food, the other one's selling drinks. But one of the things that entrepreneurs do extraordinarily well is identify blueprints that work for a business and then could be applied in a different setting. And so that's the kind of the thrust of the book, is thinking in blueprints. And when you think about what is it that led to both of these companies' successes, it's ultimately the same blueprint. And that blueprint is find something that's working in a different location and import it into your own. So in the case of Chipotle, Steve Ells did not invent burritos. He was living in San Francisco where there were burrito bars everywhere. But what he did was he took the burrito bar concept and brought it into a location where it didn't exist, which was Denver, Colorado, where it just took off and became a chain. Starbucks has a similar story where it didn't emerge out of thin air. It emerged when they studied what was happening in Italy and the coffee culture and the espresso bars that were happening there, and they brought them into Seattle. And at the time, coffee was not a big deal in America. It was all about, diners and coffee bars, I guess, that coffee shops that have made barely passable coffee, and I remember them well. And so that illustrates the idea, which is if you start thinking in blueprints of what is it that's driving this organization, or more specifically, what is it that's working elsewhere that I can import into my destination, it just becomes a recipe for finding all kinds of business opportunities. And so when we look at entrepreneurs, we think that they're more creative or they're more relentless or they're smarter than middle managers. The truth is they're not. In fact, the research bears this out. What they are very good at is identifying patterns. And so pattern thinking is the thrust of what makes them successful. And if it's something that you're considering, the better you get at thinking in blueprints, the more likely you are to succeed as an entrepreneur.
In this idea of studying others in order to kind of implement what we're learning from them is good to an extent. And I had read that you had you'd written about Tom Petty. Tom Petty is one of my all-time favorite artists. My first ever concert was a Tom Petty concert. And I read that he intentionally didn't listen or watch Bruce Springsteen. Why is that?
It's because he recognized that the style of Bruce Springsteen was very similar to Tom Petty's style. And so he didn't want to replicate his work. And I can tell you, so this is one of the strategies I talk about for evolving a winning formula. So in the book, I not only show you how to reverse engineer winning examples and turn them into a formula and a template, but I also show you how to evolve those winning formulas so that you make them your own. And one of those strategies is the strategy used by Tom Petty, which is also currently being used by Bill Maher and HBO, who does not watch John Oliver, or Jimmy Fallon. Jimmy Fallon doesn't watch either of them either. It's because they recognize that if you watch someone too closely who's already inherently similar to your own style, you're going to be moved to essentially be viewed as derivative. And so you want to make sure that your formula is unique in order for it to stand out. And I can tell you, in my case, I very rarely read authors in my space. And that's deliberate. I don't want to write like them because I want to be me.
So what do you read?
I read a lot of fiction. I read a ton of fiction. I read academic journal articles, and I read fiction. And that's my unique combination. You
can see me looking behind you right now because you got a bunch of books on your shelf.
That's right.
Like, let me see some of these fiction books.
This is undermining everything I'm saying to you right now.
I can't read. I can't see the titles.
these are actually my nonfiction collection because this is what I draw on. Sometimes, as I'm writing articles, if I want a citation of some kind, but the fiction collection's at home because I don't want to think about work when I'm at home.
Gotcha. Okay. So fiction makes, like, what is it about fiction that you think makes you a better writer? The storytelling element of it?
So this is getting into an interesting conversation. So what do I love about fiction? First of all, and this isn't to say that all nonfiction writers don't do this. Some of them excel at this quite well, which is the storytelling element. I talk about Gladwell in the book and what makes him unique. And he obviously is very good at telling stories. Recently, Adam Grant's books are also in this vein where he's very good at telling stories.
Real quick, Shane Snow is one of the best also at Cliffhangers. I think, and Smart Cuts is just packed with, so when you mentioned Cliffhangers, I get massive writer envy when reading Shane's work, and very like similar to yours, because I'm like, wait a second, how do you? Because I write the whole thing out. I'm like, wait, how can I make this a cliffhanger? And it's really hard. It's really hard when you have kind of your chapter or your section, and then it's like I got to figure out how to make this a cliffhanger, and sometimes it just doesn't work, Well, so anyway,
so here's where reading mysteries can help, because when you're reading a mystery, you have no idea where it's going to go. It's only at the end where they tie all the loose knots. But if you start with the mystery, with knowing who the killer is, now you can throw in all of these red herrings. And Gladwell does this really well. He'll ask questions that he knows are not going to lead anywhere, but they pique your curiosity. And so that is a technique that I think mystery writers use very well that can be imported into nonfiction writing and can help. So certainly, I do read nonfiction, but I try, it's not the majority of the reading that I do. And it's because I'm trying to import other elements.
What about, I have watched, my background, Ron, is in athletics, and there's this big kind of movement that's taken place over the past many years about visualization.
Yeah.
And so, our coaches or people, or even I remember Jason Day, a golfer, would do this all the time. Before every shot, he would hold his glove on his left hand with his right hand, and he would close his eyes and he'd visualize the shot. And then he'd go up and hit the shot. And so that it became really popular as he was winning tournaments. And other people have talked about this. And something that you've said is that this actually may not be useful. What do you think about visualization?
So I think visualization can be useful to a point. The challenge is when we are told stories like, the attraction principle, I think that's what it's called. And the idea that if I just visualize my success in my profession, I'll be more likely to succeed. And that turns out to be false. We have research showing that, in fact, if you visualize positive outcomes alone, and that's all you do, you're actually less likely to be successful. And it's because what happens when you visualize positive outcomes is you're temporarily sated. And so you get that instant satisfaction of seeing yourself winning that award or getting that promotion or going on that vacation. And that leads you to not try as hard as you would have if you didn't have that temporary daydream. There is, however, a useful approach to visualization that does improve performance, and that is visualizing process. So in terms of a particular golfer, if he visualizes himself holding the club a certain way, bending his knees, I don't know, whatever the process is for being more successful at execution, that's a different process. So it's not about seeing the ball go in the hole. It's about what are the steps that I need to take to execute this correctly. And so in the book, I talk about a study done by UCLA where they had psychology students who were about to take a intro to psychology test, and they assigned them into 3 groups. The first group was told to visualize themselves achieving a high score. The second group was told to visualize themselves studying for the test. And then the third group was just asked to track how much time did you spend studying. And what they found is that the group that visualized themselves studying for the test ended up getting the highest scores compared to the control group. Control group was just how much time did you study. But the group that visualized themselves achieving a high score did worse than any other group. And again, it's because they're temporarily sated. They didn't try as hard. And in contrast to that, visualizing yourself doing the work encourages you to front load decisions. So for example, if I'm asking you to visualize how you're going to study, now you're thinking about what time am I going to do it? What do I need to bring with me? Where am I going to be? Do I need to bring my headphones so that I'm not interrupted? All of that ensures that when you do study, you do it more efficiently. And so that's why we can all use visualization in everything that we do, whether it's about delivering a speech to your organization or even just writing a memo tomorrow afternoon. Visualizing the process of yourself doing it and empowers you to front load those decisions and ensure that you execute more effectively.
It's funny, Ron. This is a really good point, because I think about giving speech. I just did one yesterday, and part of what I think why it went well is because I really just I practiced a lot, I think, which is an underrated skill for anyone who's going to get up and give a talk. And I just kept as I was getting ready to get introduced, I was thinking about my practice repetitions before I went up on the stage. And I thought, I got this. Like I know this cold. And that was like the form of visualization as I went up, to go up and know it, like front and back, inside out. Because I remember thinking like, well, I just practice this over and over and over. There's nothing to be nervous about. Right. I'm just going to go up and deliver. And I feel like that, even though that was like a form of this visualization, it wasn't like I wasn't visualizing a standing ovation or anything. I was visualizing me practicing.
Exactly. Huh. And so in Decoding Greatness, I talk about practicing in 3 dimensions. And most people think of practice, they think of practicing in the present, which is what you did ahead of your talk. But there's actually 2 other dimensions that we're missing if that's all we're doing. So, and this is what professional athletes do. Is that first is visualization, which we talked about. If you visualize in a way that focuses on process, that is a useful way of harnessing, practicing in the future to elevate your performance. And indeed, there's research showing that people who deliver speeches, who visualize themselves giving that speech and occasionally faltering and visualizing themselves recovering from that temporary setback, they give the most persuasive speeches. So we know that visualization works not just for athletes, it works for speech givers, it works for surgeons feeling less anxious during a surgery, and it works for musicians who are about to learn a piece. If you can visualize yourself learning the piece, by looking through the notes, even before you step in front of the piano to start playing for the first time, you will learn it faster. So that's practicing in the future. There's also practicing in the past. And practicing in the past is known within the research as reflective practice. We've all heard about deliberate practice, which is practicing the things that you don't do particularly well and getting immediate feedback so you can make adjustments. Reflective practice involves journaling, writing what you did today, what you learned today, but also looking back at previous entries. And so a great tool for this, and I recommend it in the book, is get yourself a 5-year journal. You can find it on Amazon or any other bookstore. And what a 5-year journal does is it has a space for every day of the year with 5 slots. And those 5 slots, you use one of them to write what you did today and what you learned today. But then a year from now, if you're doing this for a year, you'll just put in your entry, but you'll also see what you did on this day a year ago. And that enables you to reflect on what you did that day the previous year. And through that process of reflecting on previous entries, we strengthen our memory, which is not a small thing, right? We identify some previous wins, and we also identify some overblown concerns, things that appeared to be huge problems at the time that we navigated fairly easily. And we can't help but compare our initial expectations to the actual results. And that leads us to transform experiences into wisdom. And so reflective practice beyond just visualization is a really crucial practice to improving at anything, and one that anybody can start using right now.
What's the third?
Oh, so we talked about practicing in the present. You want to talk about that? There's practicing in the present, which is deliberate practice. So deliberate practice is one of the keys to deliberate practice, which I think people often forget, is that unless you're practicing in a way that's hard, in other words, it's uncomfortable and it forces you to stretch, you're probably not going to grow. And that becomes really difficult to do over time, because the more often you do something, the easier it becomes, the less you're thinking about it. You're automating your responses. And what you need to do is pay careful attention to your responses in order to improve. So one of the techniques I talk about for making practicing in the present a little bit more challenging is novelty. So practice in a different location, practice with different people, mix up the different skills that you are practicing. So in other words, if you're trying to improve your basketball skills, don't just shoot free throws, mix it up between 3-pointers, free throws, layups, because that will lead to faster improvement. Can
I real quick, Ron, I want to talk about this like in the current world, although we're kind of getting out of this. There's been so many companies that have had to shift, leaders that have had to shift to leading like town hall sessions on Zoom or on whatever video platform you use.
Yeah.
And I've joined a lot of these because sometimes they'll bring on like a guest speaker or something, and I go early to watch or listen. And what's surprising in a lot of cases is that it's obvious they had not practiced. They're not prepared to utilize the technology of sharing their screen properly or having to call in an assistant to help. Can you get the screen share right? Oh, what's going on? And they don't have a light, or they don't have a microphone. They don't have a decent camera. And I don't know about you, but like, again, I'm getting practical here for anyone who's a leader.
Yeah.
That's how you show respect for other people. That's how you show respect for your team that you're leading. Practice, prepare. Don't have to call in somebody else to fix all of your problems. And I don't know how exactly this applies here, but I think it does. And maybe it's just top of mind because this has happened a few times recently. But what do you think about that aspect from a leadership perspective of showing respect for the people that you're leading by being ready to go? And one of the ways to do that is to do dry run-throughs, practice, go through it, make mistakes, fix them as you go prior to getting your entire team on the town hall.
Yeah, I think that it's understandable to me from the leader's perspective that they have a lot of things to do.
Right.
And this is just one of the things on the list. So it doesn't require, it's not worth the extra 10 minutes to do the practice because they've got other things to do. And as long as everyone gets the main idea, that's good enough. Well, I would push back on that just a little bit.
I'd push back on that a lot of bit.
I know you would. You would for sure.
Go ahead.
The reason I would push back a little bit is because what that enables you to do is be more present during the meeting. And that's not a small thing. That's actually a big part of being an effective leader. Mindful presence is key to this. This is why you see so many executives now signing up for improv classes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because that's not because they want to be funnier all of a sudden, but because they realize that improv teaches you mindful presence and deep listening. Those are crucial skills for being a better leader. And in Decoding Greatness, this is back to the point that we started off with, which is practicing in the present. One of the ways you can improve your skills at whatever it is you're trying to master is find a hobby that has overlap with the skills you need to improve in your day job. And so improv provides a great example of how leaders are stretching their skills by doing something fun outside the workplace that enables them to achieve mastery a little faster. And we can all do that no matter what it is we're trying to do. Find a hobby that has overlapping skills.
I love that. That's so true. I've done improv classes, and it is one of the most embarrassing things ever. Within the first 15 minutes, the teacher had us singing in front of the entire class of strangers, especially just awful experience. Although after the 3 days, I felt so much better, and I felt like a better communicator and definitely a better listener, which helped me. And it's certainly in what I do for a living now. Okay, Ron, I'm fascinated by a couple more of these points. So algorithms,
Right.
like the one Tinder uses. Now, Tinder is a little bit before my time, or I was before that, I guess I should say, meaning I got married before that existed. So how does the algorithms like Tinder teach us about improving our skills?
So just to be clear, I also do not go on Tinder. So but I did do, just in case my wife's listening, but I did do research on this. And so here's how algorithms like Tinder, and this applies to Spotify too, which I do listen to quite often.
Mm-hmm.
This is how algorithms make predictions about what it is that we're going to like, right? So one of the things that Tinder does really well is it predicts who you're going to find attractive. And how it does that is by asking you to rate a set of images at the beginning by, swiping left or right. Do you find these people attractive? And what it does is it looks for commonalities among the people that you find attractive in order to generate additional predictions. And then the more predictions it puts in front of you, the more people you swipe left or right on, the better its predictions get.
Because really, those apps, all they want is you to stay on their app. They want engagement, right? So they have to figure out a way to keep you on their app.
That's
correct?
one of the ways. That's certainly one of the ways. And in the case of Tinder, they will look at all kinds of things, like not just what you're swiping, but how long you're looking at it, whose profile you're reading, if you're interacting. And what it does is it's able to identify commonalities among the people you selected that you may not even be consciously aware of. So you're looking at the appearance, but after a set of like 10 people that you've rated as attractive, now Tinder can look to see what do those 10 have in common. Maybe it's a particular height, maybe they're all outgoing, and so now it's able to generate predictions. So what's the takeaway here? The takeaway is Tinder is useless without that initial collection of the people that we like. So just to bring this full circle to the beginning of the conversation, start a collection to identify what those commonalities are. And now you can start to generate predictions about what it is that makes it work and how you can execute against it. So we talked about collecting works at the office. Same is true at home. Start a collection and look for commonalities. That's how algorithms work, and it's how you can improve your ability to detect patterns as well.
Yeah, I think you gotta have this intake engine, and it needs to be regularly fueled.
Oh,
and that's
well
fueled
said. Love it.
That's fueled through the collection of whatever it is that you're curious to
I love that intake engine, because we think about, unless we're producing something, we're not productive. And I want to challenge that. Mm-hmm. With your very artfully stated comment about you need an intake engine, and curate what that engine contains. One of the things I talk about in the book is that also includes what you exclude from your intake engine, right?
Like Tom Petty and Bruce Springsteen, right?
Yeah. So you look at so many professionals who are all reading the same newsletter, who are all reading, listening to the same podcasts, and I think that you really need to question, is this bringing value to my life? And if it's not, exclude it, because through the process of excluding the same influences that everyone else has, you will make yourself unique.
Yeah, that's a really good point. How about, I've been lucky to stay in the Ritz-Carlton a few times. It's not my regular spot, but a few times. What do they know that's different from others, the secret that they know about improvement, because this is a big point I know you brought up before.
Yeah. So what they know is that metrics are the thing that will lead you to be successful. And so in the case of the Ritz-Carlton, if you haven't stayed there, it is a remarkable experience, and it is because their customer service are the thing that defines them. Yes, the place is certainly a very nice looking hotel, but if you ask people who stay there why they choose the Ritz-Carlton, it's the customer service. And what the Ritz-Carlton has realized is that they need to optimize for net promoter scores. Net promoter is market research speak for when someone stays at your hotel, how likely are they to recommend that same hotel experience to their friends and their colleagues. And the reason they're optimizing for that metric is because they realize it's not enough to just have people who are satisfied with their experience. What you want is you want them going home and talking to their friends and their colleagues about it, because that's how you get the most bookings and what enables you to charge $1,000 a night. And along the way, what the Ritz-Carlton discovered is that how you drive net promoter scores is not simply by answering people's requests when they make them, but it's by thinking beyond the expressed request to the unexpressed need. In other words, if I ask you, if I call customer service and say, does the Ritz-Carlton have a coffee shop? You could say yes, which is factually correct, or you could say, yes, we do. Would you like me to text you the menu? Do you see how taking that extra step is not just about answering my question, but digging deeper and figuring out what is it that Ron really wants? And they do that all the time. And the story I tell in the book is I also had the good fortune of staying there once. And my son, this actually, this didn't make the book, but because there were like so many crazy stories I had to put into the book. So this one didn't make it, but this is a true story. My son lost his goggles, and he was devastated. So he asked the person working there, have you seen my goggles? And they said, I haven't, but would you like me to get you a new pair? And they took him to the shop and they just got him new goggles. And didn't charge us. We just got them new goggles. And it's what you realize when you stay there is that, again, they're optimizing for net promoter scores, and they give all of their employees a budget that they can spend on any customer without having to get it approved. And that particular individual used that budget to buy my son goggles. And again, it just speaks to the importance of metrics. So anything you want to improve on, find the metric. And through that process of measuring your performance on that metric, you will inevitably uncover the drivers of that metric. So if I'm optimizing, for example, for my creativity as a writer, if I start measuring tangential things to that metric of how many hours did I spend producing creative work, I might also measure, for example, how many hours of sleep did I get the night before? How much exercise did I do? What did I eat? And I can start linking drivers to outcomes. So I can tell you, for me, if I want to have a great writing day, if I don't do cardio, probably not going to get the best possible sleep, and I'm probably not going to be all that creative the next day. So for me, that's a driver. Cardio is a driver of creativity. And I wouldn't have uncovered that if I didn't have metrics on my performance.
What do you mean? So by the way, same metric there for me. What do you, so you tested your creativity on a day when you did cardio versus when you didn't, and you did a series of experiments, or how do you, and maybe what are some other ones from a
yeah. So it sounds like you're interested in this, and I am too. We can geek out on them. So I've got an Apple Watch, and my wife, you've got one too. Yeah, my wife thinks it is a ridiculous tool that measures all kinds of unnecessary metrics. I disagree, because what I have found is that the amount of deep sleep I get is vital to all kinds of things. And it's not just about hours in bed. It's not about, like, sometimes I will only sleep for 6.5 hours, but if 3 of those hours are deep sleep, I don't need the additional time. And so what I've been interested in is what drives the deep sleep. And without question, it's cardio. Obviously, stress levels will impact it. Water intake can help. But the thing that I found that is really interesting to me is massages. If you can get a massage, your deep sleep will skyrocket. And once your deep sleep skyrockets, all kinds of good things happen the next day.
Interesting. Oh, well, that's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down when it comes to productivity. But I really like that. One other thing, though, that you did is your own reverse engineering by searching for hidden patterns in the world's most popular TED Talk. So we've talked, a good bit about speaking here, and I think it relates to a lot of other things. So you can take your own practical takeaways from it. But what did you learn through that process?
So in Decoding Greatness, I show you how to reverse engineer all kinds of exceptional works. And one of the examples I show you is me reverse engineering the most popular TED Talk, and it's the one delivered by Ken Robinson on the topic of creativity. So if you've had a chance to see this, if you go to TED Talks most popular, this will be number one on the list. And in the talk, he makes the case that schools beat the creativity out of us. And so we're all taught to get the right answer, and we don't realize that when we teach kids to just find the right answer, we're unknowingly encouraging them to not be creative, because creativity requires taking risks. So what you find when you reverse engineer it, and I do that by way of reverse outlining it and also looking at some of the metrics, what I found is that Ken Robinson uses a grand total of one fact the entire talk. So he's got a 20-minute talk and there's only one fact. Now, if I was writing a TED Talk from scratch and I didn't reverse engineer anything, I would assume, I don't know about you, but I would assume that you need a lot of persuasive facts in order to convince people of your point. This guy's got the most popular TED Talk of all time, and he's got one fact. So what is he doing differently? Well, he's got a ton of anecdotes and he's telling a ton of jokes. He's operating like a stand-up comic. And what that analysis tells you is that storytelling is the thing that drives people to TED Talks and leads them to go viral. And I think it illustrates the power of reverse engineering, because we wouldn't have known that if we were just talking about how do you create a popular TED Talk. But by dissecting one that actually worked and identifying the elements that contributed to its success, now we have a roadmap for creating our own. And it doesn't have to be one that duplicates Ken Robinson's formula, because I can tell you, for me, if I go up there with one fact and 40 jokes, it's not going to be a pretty experience for anyone. So I think what it tells you is you need to go find a TED Talk that resonates for your particular style, reverse engineer it, and then figure out, how do I apply this in a way that is both authentic to me, but also allows me to evolve this formula by perhaps combining elements. Maybe it's some portions of Angela Duckworth's TED Talk and some portions of Susan Cain's TED Talk and some portion of Dan Pink's TED Talk, and crafted, of course, to the message I want to make.
Two more questions. You got time for two? Okay.
Of course.
You dedicated the book to your grandmother. And speaking of taking risk, that's what you wrote in the dedication. Can you get personal for a moment and tell me a little bit about your grandmother and how she taught you to take risk, and maybe how you put it in action?
I really appreciate you asking me. So my grandparents met in the Holocaust. They literally met in the Holocaust and in a concentration camp. And my grandfather's gift to my grandmother was a loaf of bread for their wedding.
Wow.
And so he became a dentist. And when they got to Israel, which is where they went after the Holocaust, they knew no one, they had no family. And when I was born in Israel, I came here when I was 7. I live in New York now. When I was born, my grandfather was kind of known as the dentist in the town in which they lived. And like, he would walk down the street, he was like a celebrity. Everyone knew who he was. And how that came to be is that my grandmother went door to door, knocked on people's doors and asked them if they needed a dentist. And that's how she built that business. So talk about taking risks, man.
She's the ultimate business development rep, huh?
That's right.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Wow. I love that dedication.
I appreciate you asking. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, how have you implemented what you learned from her into your life and your career, getting outside of the science and on the stories of others? I'd love to hear, like, briefly, that wasn't my second question, but the follow-up has to happen. What do you like? How have you implemented that for you?
In my first book, The Best Place to Work, I talk about the importance of risk-taking. That's actually the first chapter, and why most organizations get this wrong by actually discouraging risk-taking, and how risk-taking is essential to learning. And I can tell you, in my life, I have certainly taken a lot of risks. Just to give you an example, this is kind of little inside baseball, but when it comes to getting endorsements for your book, there's a lot of groveling that happens. So you will write an author that you respect, and you will ask them to read your book, and you will ask them to give you an endorsement. And a lot of those you don't get responses to. Sometimes they'll just say, I don't have time. But the reality is that you, as you know, as someone who is just on an Amazon page, you don't know any of that. All you see are the endorsements, and that mindset is so crucial to thinking about everything we do in life, which is no one's going to know about your failures unless you do something just horrible, right? Which the chances are you doing that are probably not likely if you're trying to do something admirable, as we are. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a decent person, I would imagine. So I think that is so crucial to remember, which is that people are not going to know about the things that you didn't succeed at, but what they are going to see are the things that you succeeded. And by that math, the more risks you take, the more likely you are to achieve certain successes. And I just think that that is crucial to thinking about everything in terms of like applying for that job or applying for that promotion or seeking a new job. There are ways that we can all apply that to our daily life, or asking a client for another project. The more risks we take, the more likely we are to succeed. And we lose track of that because we become convinced that the failure is so painful, we shouldn't even try. And one of the things I hope that people take away from this book is that you don't have to be born with tremendous talent. You don't have to put in your 10 years of practice. What you need is a system for achieving greatness. And part of that system is taking more risks.
So I think this applies to what I was going to close with, and that is, I think you probably get a lot of requests from people who are new college graduates who are young, ambitious, want to put a dent in the world, leave people better than they found them. What are some general pieces of career/life advice you'd give to that person?
Well, clearly taking more risks is crucial. The other thing I would say is that this is true for me. I don't know how true this is. I guess I would say this is true for others as well. I think that we often assume that we need to get our career in place first, and then we'll take care of our relationships. But I think it's the opposite formula. I think if you can optimize for your relationships first, that'll give you the confidence to do things in your career that you wouldn't have otherwise done. And I think that that's true for me. I met my wife in high school, and having, I think, that stability in terms of a relationship allowed me to focus on my career. And I know that a lot of folks just say, you know what, when I get to my 30s, then I'll worry about my relationships. But I think that might be something that is overlooked. And I also think that it's remarkable to me that we don't teach in schools how to find a life partner, because that probably is the most important decision you will ever make.
Definitely.
And it seems like a lot of us just by default look for a person who is fun to hang out with or is attractive, and we forget to think about whether our values mesh, because that's the thing that ultimately is going to determine the success of your relationship.
Yeah. And you're just probably a lot smarter than most people when they're young. I was an idiot at that age, Ron. Give you huge props, made too many mistakes, but no, I think it's fantastic advice, because you're right. I think, you'll rise or fall to the level of your peer group. And number one in that peer group is your partner.
Yeah.
And I think we've all have friends who we've seen, they're lifted up by that partner. We have other ones, unfortunately, where it's torpedoes because of it. And that is such a bummer when we see it, but it's so true.
The importance of the decision making that you make is inverse to your age, because the decision and you're like at the worst possible moment to make important decisions at the age of 18 through 20. And just to be clear, I'm not smarter than you are. I got lucky. That's different.
Okay, I'll take it. Well, I'm happy for your luck. No, you made the best of it. This is awesome, man. And I could go all day. By the way, the blurbs, I'm Dan Pink, Adam Grant, Cal Newport, Jonah Berger, David Epstein. A lot of people have been on this show. Todd Henry too, a good buddy here, lives down in Cincinnati. I'm in Ohio, so with him.
Nice.
But Decoding Greatness: How the Best in the World Reverse Engineer Success. Ron Friedman, this is awesome, man. And I just like to say I'd love to continue our dialogue as we both progress, and I may be emailing you for a book blurb, just so you know, because we talked about it.
I'm excited to hear about it.
Awesome.
Sounds great. When's your book coming out?
Not announced yet, but it'll be less than a year. I've turned in the manuscript. So we're in that phase now, where you turn it in and then you get the edits back, and then you got to kind of see how terrible of a writer you are, or at least in my case, and then you fix it. No, it's fun. I love the process. I truly enjoyed the process of taking a rough sketch, an outline, turning it into a properly formatted book, and then getting the feedback from a genius author that I work with at McGraw-Hill, and she's the best. And it makes it so much better. I think for me, that's part of like the greatness, the excellence of it is that you gotta have kind of the guts to get it out there for people to judge it and say, whoa, I'm gonna have to mark this thing up. But that's how things get better. You know what I mean? So I love that part.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to read your book, and Ryan,
Thank
I appreciate the kind words and the opportunity.
Absolutely, man. Thanks so much, Ron.
Good to be here.